What's going on, folks? Here to recap round 4 of the 2026 Fide Candidates Tournament in Cyprus in the open and women's section. And we had another jam-packed day full of really interesting games. So without further ado, let's just get into it. So going into this round, Javakir and Fabiano both had 2.5 out of 3, and this was going to be a really pivotal game between the co-leaders. Javakir had the white pieces and Fabiano had black. And this position is really critical, essentially, that black chooses a great plan. It's essentially got a Queen's Gambit accepted type of vibe. Black's D pawn was already traded for white's C pawn, and there's a little bit of attention here in the center. In this position, there are a few different ways to go, but I think the easiest way to play this one is actually to play C takes D4. And the reason this is the easiest way in my view is because of the placement of the knight on C3. When white has a knight on C3 in these Queen's Gambit type of structures, it's usually misplaced. What do I mean by that? Well, if I go back, and let's go to a traditional Queen's Gambit from the beginning, we go D4, D5, C4, D takes C4, knight F3, knight F6, C3, E6, and we have this type of position, C5, let's say castles, A6, knight C3, bishop E7, let's get this type of endgame on the board. Essentially, this knight on C3 doesn't have any nice rerouting squares going forward. So a lot of times, the knight actually would prefer to be on D2. And so it tends to be a little less potent when the knight is on C3, at least when there's some more trades and so on. So if we go back to the position in question on move 9 after bishop D3, I would argue that after C takes D4, E takes D4, white has the IQP, and really it's imperative that white keeps pieces on the board. But now black can play this annoying move knight B4, hitting the bishop on D3, blockading the D5, the D4 pawn on the D5 square. And if the bishop moves away, let's say like bishop B1, for instance, well, then you blockade the square further with bishop B7. You're eventually going to put the knight on D5, and you manage also to trade pieces, and black is pretty much okay. There are other ways to handle it after knight b4, so after takes, knight b4, white can also play a move like bishop e4, but it's not really that dangerous. Black can take on e4, you can have another trade, but then the knight comes to d5, you still maintain this blockade, and even if the blockade is eventually lifted, the king is actually going to be pretty okay, even if it winds up being in the center, because black has the two bishops, and the dynamism in white's position is pretty much gone. Instead of that, Fabi decided to play bishop b7. And bishop b7 keeps a lot of the dynamics in the position and helps to justify the knight's position on c3, because now white got the opportunity to play a4, pressuring the b5 pawn, basically forcing b4, and then knight e4. And now this knight on e4 is pressuring the pawn on c5, so you're pretty much obliged to deal with that. So knight a5 was played, essentially putting pressure on this knight on e4, potentially looking at knight b3. But now white can play knight takes f6. And really, you could play queen takes f6 in this position, but the issue with queen takes f6 is this queen is actually a little bit out there, a little bit too early, and white can actually play e4. And the point is that bishop g5 is already a massive threat, and the queen is actually forced to stay in the center and maybe even get chased around with e5, and this is just not a great situation to be in. And so really, with knight a5, Fabiano did have the intent of recapturing with the g-pawn on f6, and we got a few more moves, d takes e5, knight b3, hitting the rook on a1, and then this really nice intermediate move, c6. And the point is, taking the rook on a1 is basically out of the question, because after knight takes a1, c takes b7, the a6 pawn is hanging. If the rook moves, right, bishop takes a6, bishop b5 check is an idea, and it doesn't matter whether white actually gets this knight back right away or not. The king is just too unsafe. And if I'm being honest, the knight's going to be caught, actually. It's not going to get out safely. So you can't really do that, so you got to take the pawn on c6, Fabiano does. But now there's this move knight d4, and surprisingly, this was still a part of Javakir's preparation. But the point is that you still can't really take the rook on a1, because if knight takes a1, knight takes c6, and queen b6, the knight comes back, and white is temporarily down in exchange, but the knight on a1 is essentially just trapped, and it's not going to be airlifted anytime soon. In fact, the only real way to give the knight the b3 square would be to play something like e5, but then you're weakening way too many light squares around the king to justify doing that. And you can see this king on e8 is going to have a hard time finding shelter with these double f pawns. Like castling kingside's kind of out of the question. Another thing to point out is if you're playing with like bishop c5, white can even play a move like bishop c4 and say, you know what, you might take my knight, but this knight on a1 is not coming out. The bishop's controlling the b3 square, the queen's controlling the c2 square. It's just not happening. So anyway, knight d4 is played. So that kind of forces knight takes d4. And after e takes d4, you have a position where white's king is castled, black's king isn't, and that's essentially going to be the main feature for the entirety of the game. The question is going to be, does black have enough counterplay to justify the king being in the center? And if the answer is no, black is going to lose. If the answer is yes, black might create some chances. So Fide started by playing rook g8, trying to put some pressure on the king. And I think this was probably one of the trickiest moves of the game. But unfortunately for Fide, Javakir was still in his preparation and played the move g3. And the point is that, well, okay, you are weakening this diagonal towards the king, but after a move like queen d5, which was not played, white will play f3, give up the d4 pawn with check, but then play bishop e3, the queen will have to go back. And you have a situation where white's rooks are connected, the king is relatively safe. There's not really any major issue on the king right now. You do have to deal with rook takes g3 check, but after you deal with that threat, white's king is going to be dramatically safer than black's. And white has a lead in development. And to add insult to injury, the a6 pawn is hanging in some lines. So it's just a tough position practically for black to navigate. After g3, Fide played f5, still trying to kind of, keep some options open, control the e4 square so that white is not able to trade the bishops with bishop e4, and also claim, you know what, I'm going to play queen d5 eventually, but not right away. But white stopped that with bishop c4, and now queen d5 is not on the cards, and he's still saying, here, take the d4 pawn. I don't care. If you take that pawn, there's all type of mess on the board, and we know Javakir likes to attack. Bishop takes e6 actually is an excellent attacking move, because you can't take on e6 because the rook on g8 is hanging. And in fact, the only way for black to really hang on in this position would be to play queen e4. But after queen takes e4, bishop takes e4, and bishop b3, if you just look at this position, no one would want to choose black here. The pawn structure is mangled. Even with the queens off the board, the king is very exposed. And there are just too many potential targets in the position for white to exploit. So just practically, it's a nightmare to defend. And this is actually something that Javakir pointed out after the game. So instead, after bishop c4, rook g4 was played. And again, it just doesn't fit. It doesn't work. Fide's trying to essentially tease out the idea that there's still an attack on this white king, while also maybe looking at rook takes d4 in some lines. But the bottom line here is the king is still exposed. There's no real attack on the king, and white's been very happy to give up the d4 pawn. So it's like you could take it or you can't, but I don't care. White actually now played bishop e3, actually holding on to the d-pawn. But the bottom line is it's not so much about this pawn, it's about actually connecting the rooks and getting the development going, because this king is going to be a problem. So we had some more moves, bishop d5, rook ac1, bishop e7, bishop takes a6, king f8, bishop e5, bishop f6, rook d1, and king g7. And the funny thing is black now spent all those moves to get the king to g7, but you can see the concept has been a failure. The rook on g4 is misplaced. It's not really active. You can't play f4 to put more pressure on the king side because the rook is just hanging there. And the king is just a little bit exposed, or a lot of it exposed, and white even has an outside pass pawn that you have to worry about heading into various endgames. So objectively, it's basically a lost position. And Fabiano didn't really get any chances. Bishop c6 was an excellent move by Javakir, trying to lift the blockade on the d-file. on the d pawn. Note that in any position where queen takes d5 is played, rook c5 is going to be a really nice move, pushing away the blockader. Queens are horrible blockaders, by the way. After rook a5, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5. Rook c5 happened anyway, still trying to lift this blockader. And after rook d7, d5. And the problem is, as soon as this pawn structure gets a little bit more mangled, the king is just going to be too exposed. And to add insult to injury, there's still this outside a pawn that is a massive trump in any endgame. We had some more moves. E takes d5, queen f3. You see immediately just the weaknesses in the structure. b2 is hanging, but it's not very relevant. Fide took it, but after rook takes d5, rook takes d5, rook takes d5, you can see f5 is dropping. The rook on g4, that excursion has been a failure. And again, this a pawn is a problem. So queen e8 happened, rook takes f5. There were a few more moves. h4, Javakir always happy to attack and put pressure on the king. And after a few more moves, black resigned. And why did black resign here? Well, rook c5 threatens rook c8. And you might say, well, can't black play rook e6 to block the rook c8 idea? Well, it's only temporary because now white has h6. That was the whole point of this h-pawn excursion, threatening queen g7 checkmate. And if black tries to interpose with the queen, let's say like queen g8, rook c8 actually distracts that queen from the g7 square. So something like queen takes c8, queen g7 is just checkmate. So after rook c5, Fide actually resigned. And it's just a huge win for the standings. Javakir's got 3.5 out of 4 now. Just killing it on a real nice run going into the rest day. And Fide just never really got into the game. And my bottom line takeaway was that position we look at back on move 9 after bishop d3. I think taking this pawn and playing knight b4 was the way to go, getting something that'd be a little bit more of a stable position. And I cannot understand for the life of me, in the position that actually happened in the game, why so many players insist on not castling against Javakir Sindarov, who's one of the best attackers today. I might actually make a video tomorrow discussing the takeaways of after the first 4 rounds of the candidates thus far. But one of the main takeaways, if I could tease it out for folks, is not castling has been an issue in this tournament. It's been a reason why there've been decisive results. And in 3 of the 4 games that Sindarov has played, his opponents have not castled. 3 out of 4. 75% of the games Sindarov has played, his opponents have not castled. So it's just a part of the modern game sometimes, but it can really come back to bite you. All right, next position, we have Matthias Bluebom versus Prague. And Matthias is white for a second day in a row, and he has another IQP position. And essentially what we have here is a situation where if white is able to trade some pieces, gang up on the IQP a bit further, it's going to have an advantage. In this position, it is black to move, and the biggest thing that's kind of stopping white from getting a bigger advantage now is that the queen is lined up against this rook on c8. And Prague does a great job of kind of taking advantage of that by playing the move knight e5. The point of knight e5 is to freeze the knight on c3, but also potentially to look at the c4 square. The knight on c4 is very annoying. It hits the bishop on b2, hits the pawn on a3, and it's just not a piece you necessarily want to tolerate there. So Bluebom actually took on e5, and after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, you kind of have to deal with the pin here. And so Bluebom played queen b1, but after queen b1, queen d6, black is really, really active. The rooks are connected. h2 is being hit, so that's a move being played with tempo. And if you play a move like h3 to kind of parry that threat, black can already break with d4. And you might say, well, what about rook d1? Can't you make a pin on the queen? Well, this would actually be really asking for it because bishop b3 hits the rook on d1. And it's just not a great situation. And if you insist on keeping the pin, black can even sacrifice their queen with d takes c3, rook takes d6, c takes b2, and have more than enough material for the queen, especially with this pawn on b2 being so strong and rook c1 being a threat. So with all that in mind, it's really actually hard to stop d4, and Blue Bomb decided to play f4 to stop d4, essentially saying, you know what, I'm going to try and get this bishop pair. But after bishop takes c3, knight e4, you have a situation where Matthias does have the bishop pair, but this pawn on e3 is just as weak as the pawn on d5. And, you know, if black just plays f6, which Prague wound up doing, the bishop is more or less neutralized on this diagonal, and the bishop pair doesn't really count for much. So there were some more exchanges here, but the game really never got going, never left the drawing margin, and the players agreed to a draw by repetition just before the time control. So, yeah, another takeaway. Maybe I am spoiling a little bit the video that I'd make on takeaways for tomorrow, but no one is really going crazy against Blue Bomb right now because he's actually being respected as a good theoretician and someone that you cannot go too crazy against. And so I think Blue Bomb's strategy has been to be really solid, and he's played against. Had 3 white games so far and played against the IQP 3 different occasions. But every time he hasn't really gotten anything. His opponents are playing solid openings. They're not playing King's Indian or King's Indian or any type of dubious openings. And because of that, his Blue Bomb's games have been pretty dry. And so they're really, taking him seriously as an opponent. And as a result of this, Blue Bomb is, in 3rd place right now. So I think something's going to give. Either they're going to start risking it against him, or Blue Bomb's going to try to actually play himself, because draws are not going to carry you to win a tournament like this. So especially when Sidorov is on 3.5 out of 4. All right, next game, Anish Giri playing Andrei Esipenko, and Anish had the black pieces, and I stopped it in this position here because it's already a very rare bishop g5 Najdorf, and Anish came packing. He came with the heat, with some ideas that I actually hadn't seen before, but are very, very interesting and good. And he started with this move, knight takes e4. The point of knight takes e4 actually is that bishop takes e7 is actually just a blunder or a mistake, because there's the intermediate knight takes c3, and you're actually hitting the queen on e2. So after bishop takes d8, knight takes e2, let's say bishop b6, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and e5, black is actually a pawn up for that skirmish, and white is the bishop here, but not enough compensation for that pawn. And so if we go back to the bishop after knight takes e4, it's actually a really nice move that nets a pawn. Now, Andre was actually aware of this idea, and he was still in preparation, and he played the move knight takes e4 in 10 seconds. And after knight takes e4, bishop takes g5, he played the very new and fresh knight f5. And it must be said that at this point, it's essentially who knows more in the fresh position. We know, Anish has made a course on the Najdorf on Chessable. It is many years old. I think it came out like 5 years ago or so. But the point is that, openings are always evolving, and both sides are doing their homework. Now, there are many, many choices here, actually. Black can castle. Black can actually take this knight, which looks really dangerous, actually. But it's actually possible to grab the material and then start to run with your king. But actually, Anish decided to play the move that he thought would give him the most chances to win and probably confuse Andre the most. It was the move bishop e7. And the crazy part about it is that after knight takes g7, it's not about going to f8. It's about going to d7. And it is very, very rare you have a king on d7 on move 11 and a sharp Sicilian, and it's actually objectively fine. But this is modern chess, and it is. So after castles, knight c6 and c4, you have a really strange position where the material is equal. The pawns, each side has 6 pawns, but black's king is on d7 and white's rooks are connected. So you'd say, oh, well, doesn't that mean that white's going to be better? And the answer is no, because what black has in return is this nice central pawn majority, particularly the pawns on e6 and d6 control a lot of squares in the middle. And black has the 2 bishops, and we are aware of the 2 bishops' latent potential in the middle game and the end game. And so it's really a question of whether white can get something off really quickly to justify, the lead in development and all that. And if he can't, then black ultimately has the long-term trumps. So the next few moves, white has to do stuff quick. Black played king c7, still trying to get the king out of harm's way. Knight h5 was played. Bishop d7, rook d1, rook f d1, rook c8. See, this king is finally trying to start off on e8, and now it's making its journey to try to get to b8. And here, Andre played the move b4, trying to kind of open the position and get something going before Black's king is tucked away. And you kind of have to address this. And so Anish took up the challenge and played knight takes b4. And Andre played rook a b1, which is an excellent decision. And now there's actually serious pressure on Black's queen side, because you can't just ignore the knight being attacked. And if once the knight moves, potentially there's the half open file going towards b7. And so Anish took on d3, and this is actually the critical position of the game, because if you look at it, there are two different ways to capture, and one of them is better for white, much better for white, and the other one is better for black. And it's not obvious exactly why initially, but it turns out that the move rook takes d3 is the best move, and it gives white a very, very big advantage. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. One, white actually now can potentially double the rooks in one go with rook d b3. I think that's the obvious point. Doubling the rooks makes a lot of sense. The other reason is actually there's some real hidden tactics in the position where essentially if black plays a passing move, let's say like h6, there's this idea in many positions of knight c5, which is really not a move that's obvious from afar. But the point is that after d takes c5, queen e5 is actually leading to mate. The king cannot go to b8. It can't go to the b file at all, really. And if king c6, there's actually queen e4 check, king c7, and rook takes b7 checkmate. And it's a really unique checkmate, actually. So because of that, there's this latent potential with knight c5. This is actually a tactic that black really has to worry about. And there's so many moves where knight c5 is good. Like if rook f8, knight c5 is good. If king b8, trying to get out of it, then knight takes d6, and this pawn is just hanging, and there's pressure on b7. Is there any other way to defend knight c5? Well, bishop c6 covers b7 and keeps the d6 pawn defended. But guess what is a good move here? Knight c5. And this knight c5 move keeps coming up. Here, the rook is putting pressure on the queen, so the d-pawn is essentially pinned. And knight c5 is not the best move in this position. c5 actually is. But the point is, knight c5 keeps coming up. Sometimes c5 comes up, and that's another element. The rook on takes d3 means there's pressure indirectly on the queen on d8. So Andre thought for a little while, but unfortunately, after knight takes d3, he played queen takes d3, and this really throws away the position objectively, because you're not doubling your rooks quickly. There isn't, the same level of tactics here, and there's one move in particular that makes Black's position better. I think the reason he played queen takes d3, by the way, is because Andre was trying to play some combination of c5 and knight d6, or c5 and queen g3, check and put pressure this way before the king gets to b8. But the problem here is that Black has this excellent move, bishop a4. And what it does is it defends the d6 pawn, because now the queen is in communication with the d6 pawn, and it disrupts white from playing c5. And it's just one of those moves that's very easy to miss. Like, it's very rare you see a bishop kind of leave the nest like this, attack a rook, especially when the king's in the middle like this. But that tempo is a critical tempo that forces the decision, allows Black to consolidate. So now rook d2 was played, but it's very important. The point is that if something like bishop c6, c5 would have been an issue, and there would have been this queen g3 check business of d5, and the king is not actually running away. Bishop a4 slows down c5, and now after rook d2, you have king b8, and you're able to shuttle the king away before c5 can happen. And c5 isn't even going to kill you anymore, because you actually can even you can play bishop b5 and kick the queen away, and then push for d5, and there's no problems. Note that if queen g3, just trying to maintain the pin here, there's rook g8 trying to kick the queen again, and the queen can't really stay on this diagonal. If queen f4, bishop g5, it gets hit again. So the queen does not stay on the diagonal. There's not going to be these tactical issues on the king on b8. The other thing to keep in mind is that after king b8, black is really happy to give up the d6 pawn if the queens come off the board, because there'll be a bishop versus knight scenario with pawns on both sides of the board, and the c4 pawn is actually really weak. So if you play knight takes d6, and we have some captures here, rook takes c4 is just a pawn up for black, bishop versus knight, pawns on opposite sides of the board. That favors the bishop, and the king is actually safer than the white king because black's king has an escape square, white's king does not. The tempo will have to be wasted at that point. And something like rook takes a6, it's like, oh my god, free pawn. Not really, because bishop c2 would hit the rook. And again, there's back rank problems tactically here, and there's also issues with now the rook being hanging in some positions. So essentially, the king is now safe. The black king is after king b8. And the flow of the game basically demonstrated that white no longer has any real attack, and black has all the positional trumps. So a bunch of more moves were played. c5, a few moves too late. We had some trades. It looks like there's pressure here on b7, but it's just defended. And again, there's a back rank problem here. These knights are very uncoordinated now, and f3 is a terrible move to make. And you can see these knights are just crawling up into a ball. And eventually, black's centralization, this d pawn became a c pawn. We see it's very far advanced, and soon enough, it was all she wrote. That pawn, it became the d pawn became a c pawn, and then became a d pawn again, and now it's going to become a queen. And Yesipenko resigned. Huge win for Anish to win in the Najdorf. Especially after round one, where he tried to play the Najdorf and he lost to Prague in a closed Sicilian, a Grand Prix. Really huge bounce back. He clearly has done a lot of work on the Najdorf, and it's nice to get a win with black. That gets him back to 50%. Yesipenko, unfortunately, is on 1 out of 4 on -2. Very demoralizing. He was demoralized in the press conference, and hopefully the rest day he can kind of think about things, change up some stuff, and come back hitting stronger in after the rest day. It must be said now that he has -2, now that he's on 1 out of 4, he's officially going to be the punching bag. He's the target for the time being, and it's a very uncomfortable situation when you're playing a tournament and everyone knows they need to target you. It's rough because it doesn't feel good. But that's the reality. I've been there. I've been in a situation where I've been the target in a closed event like this. And yeah, you gotta have to fight and think, I'm gonna get chances. That's the good news. You're gonna get chances when you're the target. All right. Last game in the open section featured a game between Hikaru Nakamura and Wei Yi. And looking at it here, because the material is equal and it's a rook endgame, so you think it has major drawing tendencies, and it does. But white here actually made a terrible mistake in time trouble. So it's actually black to move in this moment, and black played the move rook c4, attacking the h pawn. And this pawn is gonna be lost. There's no way to defend it. If you play g3, you run into rook c1 checkmate, and you give up your cover on the second rank. So you can't play g3. But essentially, you have to figure out the best way to give up that pawn. And on move 40, Wei Yi played the move king h2, and this is a tremendous blunder, because after rook takes h4 and king g1, the king actually can get smoked out. And after rook b1 check, king f2, rook h1, there are dreams of actually winning this game. Now, before we go forward with this ending, and I talk about what getting smoked out means, I want to go back before king h2 and note that the best move here, the clearest way to hold this, is actually just to play rook a1. And the point is, you give up the pawn h4, you bring this rook on g5, which is out of the game, back to the second rank, and you have a situation like this where you actually either force a trade of rooks or you smoke out the black rook that's on your second rank. And the bottom line is 3 versus 2 endgames, rook endgames, if there are no weaknesses for the defending side, and there's one rook, are always going to be drawn with best play. And so white would love a situation like this. This is a dead draw. In practice and blitz games, you might see something different, but in classical games or at a higher level, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to win this one. Essentially, you're going to get something that is reminiscent of the Philidor position. So if you're curious about that, look up the Philidor position. Google that. Now, essentially, black needs to do two things, or three things. They need to smoke out the king, they need to keep two rooks on the board for as long as possible, and they need to get their king active. And so after king h2, rook takes h4 check, king at g1, rook b1 check, king f2, rook h1, mission one is almost complete, which is to smoke out the king. If this king gets driven out this way, the g2 pawn will be weaker. And so Wei now played rook a2, trying to cover the second rank so black can't push the white king out further. And here there's a massive, massive opportunity to win and make inroads. And I was shocked that Hikaru didn't play this move, because to me, I would play this move immediately, and it's a very obvious move. It's move h4. You essentially want to check the king away from this kind of radius here that I'm drawing. And if you're able to check the king away from that, the g2 pawn will be weak, and you'll be able to potentially make some inroads on the king side. And so you want to make sure that when you check, the king can't go to g3. Instead, Hikaru played king g7, and I think his point was that he wanted to keep more tension in the position and keep Wei thinking and worried about what to do. But it actually greatly eases the white's defensive task, because you really do have no business allowing the king to come toward g3 at some point. And it also gives white time to solve this problem of the rook on g5, which is really not good here. It's really misplaced. It was initially defending g2, but the rook on a2 is doing that now. So it really serves no purpose here and needs to get somewhere more active. So unfortunately, this allows Wei the time to do something, and he played the move rook e5. Now, funnily enough, rook e5 is actually maintains as a losing move. It keeps the position lost, and instead rook d5 was better. I think the real reason between the difference between rook e5 and rook d5 is that if rook f1 check happens, or rook from either rook, and the king can't go to g3, you don't want the king to actually have to go all the way out to e5. So let me just give you an example. Let's say rook e5, h4. I'm just making a passing move. Now this check on f1, king e3. There's some positions where if you give a check and the king is actually on e5, this is a disaster, because the king is going to be cut. And so something like h3, gh3, rook f3 is just totally winning, because the king cannot come support the remaining pawn it has, and out the king cut. This is an easy dub for the black player. I mean, you basically just walk the king in, and this one is cut. So really shocking that rook e5 was played. That's not a good move either. But again, Hikaru now has this opportunity to play h4 and ensure that the king cannot go to g3 when you start to hassle it outside of the zone. And instead, Hikaru decided to be patient and played the move king h6. And this isn't a good move, and it essentially throws it away to some degree, because now white can get more coordinated and play the move rook e2. And so in the past few moves, what has happened? Black has moved their king to try to get active, but they've not pushed the white king away from this zone, which was the priority. Rook f1 was played now, and this move throws away the win completely. And I can't explain this move. I just can't. Now, again, there's a lot of tension in these games. Mistakes are going to happen. But the first order of business is to push the king away, but make sure it cannot go to g3. And now the king can go to g3. So it makes no sense to me. Again, you have to try to make sure the king cannot go there. And so you can do that by playing h4, which, the computer actually says is not the best move, and it's objectively not a win. or you could start with king g5, which is the best move. And the point is now king g3 doesn't work because rook bf1 traps the king and threatens checkmate. h4 is a checkmate in one threat. If rook b2, h4 is mate. And so because of that, and rook a4 or rook a5 check doesn't help because f5. And so because of that, f4 check is a mate threat, and the only way to parry it would be to try and give up another pawn, and 3 versus 1 is going to be winning, and it doesn't even really parry the checkmate threat, it delays it. So shockingly, rook f1, king g3 is played. There's no h4. There's not even any checkmating ideas with king g5 now, which is what Hikaru played, and you would have preferred the rook back on h1. And now this, again, gives white ample time to cover, and so, Wei played rook a4, and that's it. There's no more mating patterns. There's no more h4s happening. And, rook h1 was played going back. That's kind of admitting the mistake. But now after rook e4, there's just simply no rook h4. There's no h4 check ideas. And the game petered out here. Rook b2, rook a b4, trying to trade a pair of rooks. Hikaru obliged. And now, the 3 versus 2 is just a draw, and this is as drawn as it gets. And so, pretty big miss by Hikaru going into the rest day, because he had a chance to get back to 50%, and he is chasing a very, very hot Sindarov, as is all the players. And so you don't normally get chances like that. And he can now point to 2 games where he could have gotten more than he did. If you recall, in his round 1 game against Fide, he had many draws, not many draws, but he had a few draws along the way that he missed, and he lost that game. This one, he could have won, he drew. And I said in the first video, first round 1 recap, that it's these draws, these draws that are that turn to losses, or these draws that become wins. It's these half points here and there that make all the difference. And he already has cost himself 1 point based upon these missed opportunities. All right, on to the women's section. So in the women's section, Anna Muzychuk, basically shoved all her pawns on the queen side and tried to really take down Katerina Lachnau. And in this position, Lachnau is under real pressure before the time control, but very accurately plays the move queen h6. It is super important to get the queens off the board when you have c5 coming as a threat. There's some positions where if the rook gets in, that's going to be problematic. The knight's covering now, but barely. And so that makes a lot of sense. And Anna, to her credit, found a way to keep the game going here in a really brilliant way. And it was this move, queen h3 check, queen e6, queen e3. They did repeat once. And then d4. And d4 is a stunning decision. And the point is that you're threatening c5 even if the queens get traded. So queen takes e3, f takes e3, you're threatening c5, so you're going to get the piece back. And, after c5, if the knight ever moves, the rook a8 check is a huge problem. Now, black is a piece up and can give up the piece for a few pawns. So the best line would be e takes d4, e takes d4, rook e8. Just, say, you know what, I'm going to lose the piece, but I'm going to get some pawns for it. Because, white does have 2 extra pawns right now. And after c5, rook takes c4, c takes d6, c takes d6. There's a little bit of pressure here. White has a rook on the 7th rank. Black has to defend it, the pawn f7, but the material is equal, and most of the real assets are gone in the position, so it should peter out with best play. Instead, and Katerina, to her, to be fair, she has had a lost position every game in this event so far, and was leading the pack on 2 out of 4 or 2 out of 3 before this game. And she's been rolling the dice a little bit, and she did again by playing e takes d4. And it's really an inexplicable decision, particularly in the time trouble she's in. She has 12 moves to get to move 40 in 5 minutes. But it keeps the queens on the board. And now Anna's licking her fingers, being like, okay, queen takes d4, bet. I'm threatening c5 now, and I still have the queens on the board. A huge difference, and that's why the eval balloons. And it was over quick. King b7, c5, the piece is recovered. Rook a8, c takes d6, really nice move, not trading the rooks because the queen's actually defending a1. And after queen takes d6, rook takes a8, brilliant move. And the point is that if queen takes d4, rook b8 is checkmate. And this is a wonderful pattern. Knight protecting the rook, pawn protecting the knight, no escape squares for the king. And the problem is there's no way to take this that helps. If you play knight takes a8, queen a7 check picks up the knight with check. So there's no back rank mate because it's picked up with check. And then you can even trade the queens. And last but not least, if you take with the king, this is perhaps the prettiest, as another bit of geometry with queen a1 check. Going backward, the king goes somewhere, and then queen a6 is mate. So it's funny, the rook on b8 was made earlier, now the queen on a6 is mate. Same deal, every piece is protected, and yeah, it's just mate. And so after rook takes a8, Lucknow resigned, and her luck kind of ran out a little bit. So she's on 2 out of 4, amazingly on 50%, having a lost position every game. She used the one that had that brilliant g4 check, or g4 move yesterday. It wasn't a check, but this brilliant queen sacrifice yesterday, or brilliant piece sacrifice yesterday. And yeah, maybe after the rest day, she's going to stop rolling the dice because you can get burned like this. And Anna Muzichuk, to her credit, is now on +1 on 2.5 out of 4, playing pretty well. Again, she replaced Humpy. So good on her now, really showing, making an impact. All right, next game. Tan Zhongyi was black. She lost a very tough game yesterday to Katerina Lucknow after having a winning position. And Bibi Sara won a nice game yesterday. And in this position, Tan Zhongyi is under a bit of pressure. The pawns are on the queen side are a little bit loose, particularly this pawn on b7. And the queen on e8 is in the way of the rooks being connected, but doesn't have any really good square to go to, because if you go somewhere like queen d7, knight f6 is a discovered check. So it's it's tricky to defend the queen side. And the other thing to be made aware of is that if you play b6, you're losing on the spot because of rook takes c6, rook takes c6, queen takes c6, queen takes c6, and knight e7 check. And you can see white picks up a piece. So because of those tactics, you really can't defend the b7 pawn in a reasonable way, and you have to kind of try to seek out counterplay. And Zhongyi does this really well. She plays bishop g4, hitting the rook on d1. The rook moves, and then again, instead of defending the pawn, which she could have done, she could have gone queen d7 now. There's no tactic anymore because the rook is off of the d file. But instead she played knight e5. Excellent decision. Saying, you know what, I'm going to try and get in on these weak and light squares, and you can have my b7 pawn. If I get enough piece activity, I'm going to be happy with it. And after queen takes b7, rook b8, another excellent move, offering another pawn, the a7 pawn, because now knight d3 is a move as a fork. Note that a move ago, knight d3 did not work because knight e7 check was actually really nice. And the king has to move, and then rook takes c8. And actually, you have no time to take on e1 because... Oh, excuse me, not rook c8. I take that back. Knight takes c8. Rook takes c8 actually doesn't work, I think, because bishop takes c8. Yeah, and the queen is actually hit. So that wasn't the issue. The issue was actually knight takes c8. And white's taking a rook. Sure, black can take a rook as well. But after the skirmish, you can see that a7 is still hanging. The knight on e1 is loose. The queen is attacked. It's just not a good recipe. And after queen e6, rook takes e1, queen takes e6, queen takes a7, white would just be 2 pawns up in a winning position. So because of that, after rook b8, queen takes a7, knight d3, you have a position where essentially we have the skirmish where the tactics finish, and black has a rook and for a bishop is up in exchange, and white has 2 pawns for. White has the e pawn and the a pawn. Now, this would be winning if this pawn was further. If this pawn was on like a6, for instance, and white would be winning. And I'm going to actually show that. a4 was played here, so I don't have to shuffle too much. Let's say king g8 was played here, and then we have this. Yeah. And this is what I wanted to show. If this pawn was on a6, this bishop is supporting the queening square, the queen is supporting a7, and this pawn would just have to be ushered down the yellow brick road, and it would queen. And, white would be winning. Because the pawn is not far enough yet, black has chances to draw because they can blockade it. And that's exactly what happened. After a4, queen a5 was played, very important. Queen d7, f5, really nice defending. h4, rook d8, rook c8, the rook shuffle, and essentially it's really hard. Actually, white gave up the pawn, but even before this, it's really hard to shuttle this pawn further. It's just not really possible, honestly, and that means that Tan can hold the game together. And this is an important save for her going into the rest day. So we got some more exchanges. The queens came off, and they agreed a draw. Good hold by Tan. All right, next game was a game between Divya Dishmukh and Zhu Jinner. And Zhu's actually had a hard time of it because she's had great positions in every game but hasn't converted her positions. And this one, she actually managed to do so. And I'm maybe giving it away a little bit quickly. But in this position, black is already a pawn up, and the d4 pawn is really weak. And in order for Divya to have really any compensation for it, she has to act really quickly. In this position, it turns out the only move to really stay in the game in a meaningful way was rook takes e6, giving up the exchange. And the point is, after queen takes e6, queen takes b6 is winning a material. And now you have two pieces for the rook, because if knight takes b6, the queen on e6 is hanging. That much Divya saw, no doubt about it. What she perhaps did not see or appreciate is that black has this move a4, and it seems like the rook is now lost because white can no longer play queen takes b6 because it's not a pin. Knight takes b6 is not a pin, and it's here rook takes h6 check. Yeah, you can win the queen, but you're just down a little bit too much material, and your pawns are still weak. It doesn't work, and the queens are off the board. But instead, after a4, instead of playing queen takes b6, you can play rook takes h6 and kamikaze that rook. And the point is, after g takes h6 and queen d3, you have very good compensation for your exchange. Now, black has 6 pawns and white has 6 pawns, so you don't have any pawns for it. But the weakened light squares and the diagonals I've drawn towards the king mean that white has really nice play. And there's this pin still on the knight on d5. And so it's not like white is better or anything, but there is compensation that, honestly, in a practical game could be hard to handle. Instead, Divya played a4, and with this, any type of initiative really evaporates because Zhu took a second pawn. And now being 2 pawns up, it's just a bit too much. And now rook takes e6 here does not have the same impact because the bishop on b6 is not hanging. So, black can recapture on e6. Sure, knight f4 can be played, but black can move away. And yeah, you can definitely get, a pawn here, but the king is just too weak. The rooks are still on the board. The queen's still on the board as well. And the pawn structure is not split like it was before. So a move like rook a8, rook e2 is going to infiltrate and be problems for white's king. So after that, Zhu's essentially 2 pawns up, and it really was a cleanup on L5 exercise at the grocery store. Essentially just encroaching, trying to trade pieces, encroaching, taking more space, winning more pawns. And Divya actually resigned before the time control because you look at this position, white is down a bajillion pawns, and this king is really exposed, and d2 is just going to make another queen or win more material. Note that the d1 square is covered. So tough break for Divya, who now is on -1 on 1/2 and f4, and really good job on Zhu. She did get back to 50% after a tough day yesterday, and based upon how she's played through the opening in the early middle game, she could definitely have more points than 50%. So I'll look for her to really bounce back in the second half not the second half, after the rest day. Last but not least, we had a game between Alexandra Gorechkina and Vaishali. And in this position, black is better because the pawn a6 is a little bit weak, and the central tension can now explode a little bit with d4, which Goretzkina actually played. And Vaishali needs to be really careful now because, essentially it seems like black is taking over, and these pawns could actually be targets. They're pawns that white expanded to gain space, but they can be targets. And after e takes d4, there was a really critical move here that Goretzka needed to play in order to maintain advantage, and it's the move e takes d4. Now, the reason e takes d4 is really good is because after a move like queen c5, black can actually play knight d7, forcing the queens off, and after queen takes d6, c takes d6, there are two problems, really three problems, well, four problems here actually. The a6 pawn is weak, so something like knight b8 could round up the a pawn. The b4 pawn is weak, so this rook is tethered to the b pawn. The c2 pawn is weak, and on a half-open file, this d pawn makes the c pawn backward. And last but not least, there's an outpost on e5 for black's knights. So this would actually be positionally a disaster and very difficult to deal with. And Goretzkina actually envisioned a position like this with her decision. Her decision was to play knight takes d4. And the idea was that after queen c5, which was played, she wanted to play knight d7 now. And the point is, after knight d7, queen takes d6, c takes d6, it looks like two of the three factors are still there. The a pawn is still weak, so knight b8 might be a thing. The b4 pawn is a potential target, so maybe at some point knight c6 going back and hit the pawn. But there are two critical features that are no longer there. One, the e5 square is no longer an outpost, potential outpost for black's knights, because there's a pawn on e5 now, and that's different than if black recaptured with that e pawn. And secondly, the c pawn is no longer a backward pawn. So the e pawn, if it was a d pawn, would make the c pawn a backward pawn. Say that 5 times fast. The e pawn that was a d pawn e pawn that could have been a d pawn would be blockading the c pawn. So basically, because of the two factors that are no longer present in this position, it allows Vaishali to play c4. And c4 means that now there's pressure on b5. It's not a backward pawn anymore. You're a little distracted from putting pressure on the a and b pawns, and this is just enough to hold the game together. And it kind of petered out after this. There were a few more moves, but white was really not worse. And in the final position, there was a repetition here, but white could have even potentially played on with c takes b5, and we would have had a whole nother drama, a whole nother time control, time pressure situation going towards move 40, but they repeated instead. All right, so that was the games from the open and the women's section. Going into the rest day, we have Anna Muzichuk and Bibisara Asabaeva on 2.5 out of 4, so they're on +1. And you have in the open section a sole leader, Javakir Sindarov, on +3 with 3.5 out of 4. Both, it's still early days. There are 11 games to go, there are 10 games to go. This is through round 4. There are 14 rounds. So many games left, a lot more to see, but many more adjustments as well for the players. And I might make a video tomorrow to talk about some of my takeaways from the first 4 rounds. So potentially stay tuned for that. In any case, have a good rest of your day wherever you are, and I'll bring you more recaps soon. So, peace.